Study Session 2. Transformation of Traditional African Political Systems. Introduction. In the previous study session, you learned about how the features which define how African politics came about. In this study session, we will explore the transformation of indigenous African political systems and the consequences of the transformation. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to explain the reasons for political transformation of Africa by the colonialists. Discuss the methods of mechanisms for carrying out the transformations. Also explain what political economy is all about. Discuss how and why the colonizers used it on African political and economic system. You should be able to defend the view that Africa had a strong and distinctive political economy before the advent of the colonialists. A need for political transformation under colonialism. The colonizer was a total stranger to Africa when he started his adventure. He was handicapped not only by his lack of knowledge of the physical terrain which he sought to annex and rule, but also by his abysmal ignorance of the political arrangements of the communities he stumbled upon. What is more, he could not understand any of the components of the political life of the communities. He was, for instance, totally ignorant of the political symbols or how political decisions were made, what constituted the use and abuse of power, as well as how the systems managed to endure through their crisis management mechanism. Since he came to Africa not only to learn but to teach and to exploit, he played down all that he was ignorant of and embarked on the teaching of what he knew and was familiar with. He circumvented all the components of traditional political life mentioned above. At first, he reduced all the political problems to technical problems and offered his own solution. Later, he introduced brand new symbols, political decision-making processes, political institutions, and all that he needed to rule effectively. The ones he rejected were called traditional, while those ones he introduced were referred to as modern. The so-called modern political institutions were in fact models that were adapted for African colonies. They were not introduced in their prior forms. If, for instance, he introduced democracy in its popular form into the colony, the colonial governor would have no business giving assent to bills before it became laws. He was not a representative of the people that he governed. Mechanisms for the transformations of the traditional political system. The mechanisms differed from one colonizing state to the other. This is due to different colonial policies which they adopted. In other words, the British approach was different from the French, Portuguese, Belgian, Spanish, and the German as long as the colonial rulership lasted in Africa. Again, each colonial power changed their approach from one stage of colonialism to another. The following approaches were common if we disregard details of execution. Prohibition. By declaration of political structure, symbol of processes is made illegal. Under localism or indirect rule, the traditional ruler who was a political leader in the community was converted into an administrator, executing rules handed down by the resident colonial administrator. In most cases, the prohibition is pronounced by the chief on behalf of the paternalistic colonial administrator. As a prelude to massive assaults on the traditional political system that will follow, spurious treaties of friendship and protection were signed, in most cases under pressure by traditional rulers with colonial adventures. J. A. Barnes reports that in the heydays of imperial expansion in Africa, British agents were provided with printed treaties forms which they could be completed by the names of traditional rulers as they went on their journeys of colonial expedition. As the full implication of the treaties unfolded, some traditional rulers put up resistance to various aspects of colonial rule and were speedily exiled from their domain. In this manner, Prepe, king of Ashantis, and King Jaja of Opobo were exiled. It is noteworthy that the loss of indigenous sovereignty of the polity usually preceded the attempts at transformation traditional political systems. Constitutionalism. Through the use of constitutions, colonial authorities transformed indigenous political systems into adapted forms of Western models. This mechanism was in widespread use in British, French, and Belgian territories. For instance, from 1922 to 1960, various constitutions formed the milestones in the transformation process of the modern state. From the Clifford Constitution of 1922 through Richard's Constitution and Macpherson Constitution to the Independence Constitution of the 1960s, the British incrementally introduced and adapted models for Westminster systems in Nigeria. The story is the same in all Anglophone and to a certain extent in Francophone African colonies. It is instructive to note that nationalist activities in colonies were directed towards rapid transformation so that the political power could pass into the hands of indigenous politicians. One should add here that the British colonies, where a sizable population of whites existed, these minorities were favored in the distribution of political power as the colonies went through transformation. Such discriminatory practices with racial overtones were responsible for war of liberation, which indigenous Africans had to wage in order to establish majority rule, especially in Rhodesia, which is now in Zimbabwe. In Portuguese territories of Angola and Mozambique, the story is scarcely different because the colonial administration simply integrated a small minority of Africans known as assimilados into the mainstream of Portuguese politics and made very slow progress towards modernization of colonies which officially constituted overseas provinces of metropolitan Portugal. The friction was terminated by African nationalists through long-drawn wars of liberation. Please take note that it is instructive to note the nationalist activities in colonies were directed towards rapid transformation so that the political power could pass into the hands of indigenous politicians. One should add here that in British colonies where a sizable population of whites existed, these minorities were favored in the distribution of power as colonies went through transformation. Such discriminatory practices with racial overtones were responsible for the war of liberation which indigenous Africans had to wage in order to establish majority rule, especially in Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe. Introduction of colonial political economy. It is important for you to know that it was necessary for the colonizers to change the political system and other political activities that related to it before indigenous politics could undergo that kind of total, effective, and everlasting transformation which the colonizer needed. Therefore, it had to attack spheres which make up socio-political life of the polities. Thus, the material, production, distribution, and exchange processes that were indigenous to African society were attacked. We can therefore say that transformation was not just transformation. We can therefore say that the transformation was not transformation of the political sphere, but rather transformation of the indigenous political economy. The Oxford Universal Dictionary defines political economy as the art of managing the resources of a people and its government. This definition was first given by Adam Smith, one of the earliest scholars in the field of political economy, which is the theoretical science of the laws of production and distribution of wealth, according to Mark Kulloch. Please know that you must realize that the whole political economy of any polity must be changed before the politics of the polity can be transformed, because politics itself is no more than the processes of authoritative allocation of resources. Resources in terms of their production, distribution, and exchange obviously belong to the economic sphere of the life of human beings. This explains why we must pay particular attention to the economy of the polities and changes that they underwent in order to understand fully the transformation which occurred in the colonial era. As you know, the importance of things like food, shelter, and clothing to human beings and their capacity to handle these basic needs cannot be overemphasized. Availability or non-availability of these resources, including their pattern of distribution in any society, spells social problems. Therefore, a change in the political economy of the polity registers effects on the social life of the political society inhabiting the polity. So we can now conclude this argument by saying that the transformation which occurred in African indigenous polities was not limited to political sphere alone. It began in the economic, social, and cultural spheres of lives of people living in the polities. It was a pervasive transformation. It is instructive to note that rather than changes in political sphere, it is the changes in the polity, because material resources stand at the center of human activities on earth. Once the most important and the most vital aspects of the life of the polity had been tampered with and controlled by the colonizer, the people lost their economic independence completely. In the process of introducing a new political economy, the political economy of the colonialism, that is, the colonizer established a teacher-student relationship between him and the colonized. This relationship, in most cases, resulted in the master-servant relationship. Even today, many years after political independence, this relationship still persists in various forms. The dependence that it still engenders marks out Africa as a political region of weak nations and unstable political economies. Political economy of pre-colonial Africa. Part of the reason why scholars began to dig into African past was the allegation by the West that Africa had no past worthy of mention and systematic study, and that the history of Africa began with their contact with the West. In other words, the Africans began meaningful existence of Homo sapiens with their colonization by Europe. Research into pre-colonial politics economy of the continent has proved this allegation wrong. Instead, it is known that before the heydays of colonialism, there was already in place a political economy with distinct features. Periods in the development of pre-colonial political, economic, and their characteristic features. In order to help your understanding of the development of African political economy before colonization took over, it is important to know the various stages that are identifiable. Each stage is linked up with a period. Thus, the following periods are identified. 1. The communal mode of production, the slave mode of production, and the feudal mode of production. 1. Communal mode of production. At the beginning of the emergence of African political societies, the clan represented the unit of social organizations, and in terms of social production, the family was the basic unit. It was the clans in their clusters that built up traditional polities, which also developed into kingdoms and empires. At this stage of production, agricultural and pastoral activities were undertaken. Agricultural activities were limited to the tropical rainforests, areas, as well as the other climatic belts with sufficient rainfall to support cultivation of trees and root crops. Pastoral activities dominated production efforts in areas with little rains. Ownership of lands was communal, while its use was regulated and managed by the chief and individual families. Land and labor formed the major means of production, while in addition, agricultural implements and herds of animals were very important to the agriculturalists and pastoralists respectively. It is important to note at this stage of production that there was equal access to land, the regulation of which was conditioned by egalitarian principles and proven need. Both lands and animals were transferable, but in the case of land, an inheritor must demonstrate his ability to continue to farm the land, otherwise is reversed to community for fresh allocation. An essential feature of this mode of production was cooperating at all levels. There was also cooperation in the form of pooling of labor and material resources. Mutual assistance and deep sense of responsibility to the community in all economic matters were also important ingredients. The community frowned at cheating and bad practices. Laziness was visited with profound social sanctions. Another feature of this period is the absence of social classes. Relations among people and social roles were dictated by age and status and not by social classes. Political participation of individual was determined by the generation to which he or she belonged. The exercise of power and authority was vested in elders who were initially elected, but as such exercise became institutionalized, it also became hereditary, thus losing its initial democratic content. In the exercise of power and authority, checks and balances that exist. A chief could be moved in such checks and balances. A chief could be moved if such checks and balances were not recognized by him. Despite the crude mode of production, enough was produced to cover the need of the community, and some surpluses were also recorded. Such surpluses served as objects of barter with neighboring communities based strictly on need. Please take note that despite the crude mode of production, enough was produced to cover the need of the community, and some surpluses were also recorded. Such surpluses served as objects of barter with neighboring communities based strictly on need. Slavocratic mode of production. As interaction among various communities increased, so also conflicts increased among them. Expansionist impulses in some cases give rise to feuds over land. In some other cases, inordinate ambition to expropriate wealth of another community caused conflicts that were carried out in forms of organized raid on weaker communities. And know that such raids ended with the captures of animals, land, and people. Human beings thus became slaves. When a mode of production is based essentially on slave labor, like the one that we shall discuss shortly, we'll say it is slavocratic. Since slave labor was crucial to the mode of production, the organization of communities and their activities were dictated by sources of slaves from wars, raid, and other conflictual activities, and defense of territories and prevention of enslavement. In other words, military activities perpetuated this mode of production. This development brought in other changes in social relations and the exercise of political power. Decentralization was occasioned by emergence of feudal lords whose source of wealth and power was warmongering. This coincided with the emergence of military classes and warlords. The polities themselves became military democracies. This development was observed in Africa around the 10th century. Also take note that aside from slave labor, other means of production in slavocratic mode were lands and arms. Communal ownership of these resources could not persist as individual warlords developed ranting ambitions. Land cultivation and construction of infrastructure such as road, bridges were left for the slaves to do. They also formed the bulk of the army. Free men also farmed but unemployed slave labor. The elders also served as political advisors and logisticians. It is noteworthy that the status of a slave was not a perpetual one under this mode of production. A slave got integrated into the family of the captive with time, and in most cases, they are known to have become rulers of their captors, cashiers, and ambassadors. Slavocratic mode of production threw up more surpluses than preceding mode of production. Private appropriation of such surpluses by chiefs, elders, and free men came to existence. This is therefore the first class society and the first exploitative society. Slaves were exploited by the free men. 3. Feudal mode of production. This mode of production is defined by two main actors. These are fief and a serf. The fief is landholding, self-owning, possessed distinct political power and authority in a decentralized administrative system, an attested member of the military and therefore the ruling class. The serf is economically just a step away from the slavery because it enjoyed some measure of economic freedom no matter how small. But for all practical purposes, the serf stood in a personal bond of dependence upon feudal lord. These were peasant producers for expropriation of landlords. The social relations were exploitative as surpluses flowed into the coffers of the landlord in form of tribute. The amount of tribute payable is entirely dependent on the consumption need of the landlord. His need must be covered by the sweat of the serf. Also, ownership of land defined social classes under this mode of production. Thus, land-owning chiefs and their vassals constituted the ruling class. Class divisions were clear and unmistakable. By the 17th century, a group of artisans skilled in various arts emerged as economy called for such specialized skills. Thus, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, carpenters, and sculptors emerged. Take note. It is instructive to note that all periods identified in the development of pre-colonial political economy of Africa and described above paid particular attention to culture. Surpluses were allocated to the promotion of culture as well as evidenced today by highly intricate works of art and artifacts that now do us proud as a people with glorious pasts. Let's have the study session summary. In this study session, we discuss the reasons for the political transformation of Africa by the colonialists and how the colonizer transformed indigenous political systems into adapted Western models to facilitate his understanding of political environment in which he had to operate. The political economy of African states before colonization was also examined.